You don't need time, you need clarity. The negotiation you have every morning. You don't need more hours, you've already had them. More mornings than you can count where the day opened up in front of you with real space inside it. No urgent meeting, no one pulling at your attention, no excuse ready and waiting. Just you, and the time and the quiet possibility that today might be different. And then the negotiation begins. Not out loud. Never out loud. It happens somewhere beneath conscious thought, in that grey space between waking and deciding. What should I do first? What actually matters? What can wait one more day without real consequence? What version of this day am I actually capable of showing up for right now? That negotiation is exhausting. Not because the questions are hard, because they never end, because you had the same conversation yesterday, and the day before, and somewhere in the middle of it, the time that was supposed to feel like freedom starts to feel like pressure, wearing a different name. Most people diagnose this as a discipline problem, or a motivation problem, or the specific kind of failure that belongs to people who know what they should do and somehow never quite do it. So they look for solutions in that direction. Better systems, stricter routines, more accountability, more structure. And those things help sometimes for a while, until the morning arrives when the structure is in place and the negotiation happens anyway. Because the problem was never the structure. It was never the time. There is something that has to exist before any of that. Before the schedule, before the list, before the decision about what comes first. Something quieter than discipline, and more fundamental than motivation. Something the Stoics wrote about not as a philosophical ideal, but as the only thing that makes any of the rest of it possible. Clarity, not the feeling of clarity. Not the inspired morning where everything suddenly seems obvious, the kind of clarity that holds when the feeling is gone. The kind that doesn't require negotiation, because the question has already been answered at a deeper level than any single morning can touch. That's what this video is about. Not time management, not productivity, not another system for extracting more output from the same hours. This is about understanding why clarity is the thing that was missing, and what it actually takes to build it, starting not with a formula, but with something you probably haven't looked at directly in a long time. The question of what you actually know about yourself, and what you've been pretending to know, because those two things are not the same. And the distance between them is exactly where the negotiation lives. Why more time always disappears. Think about the last time you had a completely free day. No obligations, no one waiting on you. Hours that belonged entirely to you, to use however you decided. And notice what actually happened, not what you planned. What happened? For most people, the day filled itself, not with the things that mattered most, with the things that were easiest to begin. The inbox, the feed, the small tasks that feel productive without requiring any real decision about direction. And by evening, the hours were gone. Not wasted exactly, but not used for anything that moved something forward in a way you could actually feel. That's not laziness. That's what happens when a mind has space but no orientation. The brain doesn't tolerate a vacuum. When there's no clear answer to the question of what this time is actually for, it defaults. It reaches for whatever is most familiar, most immediately rewarding, most cognitively available. Not because you're weak, because that's what any system does when it hasn't been given a direction. It conserves energy by repeating what it already knows. And here's the part that makes this genuinely difficult to solve with more time. More time doesn't change the default. It just gives the default more room to operate. A free weekend without clarity isn't an opportunity. It's the same drift, expanded. The same negotiation, stretched across 2 days instead of one. The same quiet frustration arriving on Sunday evening, wearing the specific face of another week that didn't quite become what you needed it to be. Seneca saw this with a precision that still lands hard centuries later. In his letters to Lucilius, he wrote that no amount of time is enough for the man who doesn't know what he's going to do with it. He wasn't describing procrastination. He wasn't describing laziness. He was describing something structural, a condition that precedes behavior, that sits underneath every choice and determines its quality before the choice is even made. The problem isn't that you don't have enough time. The problem is that time, without something to orient it, behaves like water. It takes the shape of whatever container it finds. And if the container is habit, distraction, and the path of least resistance, that's exactly the shape your days will keep taking, regardless of how many hours are inside them. Sit with that for a moment, not as criticism, as diagnosis, because most people spend years adding more hours to a system that was never broken by lack of time. They restructure their mornings, they block their calendars, they buy new planners, and the drift continues. Not because those tools are useless, but because tools don't create orientation, they only serve it. Which raises the real question, the one that matters more than any scheduling system. What would it actually mean to have that orientation? What were the Stoics pointing at when they described clarity? Not as a feeling, not as a destination, but as something a person builds and maintains on purpose. The answer is more specific than most people expect, and considerably less comfortable. What the Stoics actually meant by clarity, the version of Stoicism that circulates most widely right now, is useful, but it's partial. Focus on what you can control, accept what you can't. Build discipline, resist impulse, these are real and they matter. But they're downstream of something the texts point to with far more insistence, something that has to be in place before any of those practices can take hold. Marcus Aurelius returned to it throughout the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. Not once, not as a passing observation, but repeatedly, the way a man returns to something he keeps needing to remind himself of because it keeps slipping. He wrote about the importance of knowing what you're actually doing and why, not in the strategic sense, in the most fundamental sense. What is the nature of the action I'm about to take? What does it serve? What am I? And what is this moment asking of me specifically? That sounds abstract until you understand what he was really describing. He wasn't talking about goals. He wasn't talking about a life plan. He was talking about identity, the kind that operates beneath ambition, beneath preference, beneath the surface layer of what you want and don't want on any given Tuesday. The deep structure of who you are when no one is watching and nothing is required of you. The values that are actually running your decisions, as opposed to the ones you believe are running them. Most people have never looked at that distinction directly, and the gap between the two is enormous. Epictetus was even more direct. In his discourses, he described the unexamined person as someone perpetually reactive, moved by whatever arrives, shaped by whatever is most recent, never quite author of their own direction because they've never established what that direction actually is. He didn't call this weakness. He called it the natural condition of someone who hasn't done the specific work of knowing themselves at the level that produces real orientation. That work has a name in Stoic philosophy. It isn't meditation in the modern sense. It isn't journaling as self-expression. It's examination. The deliberate, honest, sometimes uncomfortable act of looking at what you actually believe, what you actually value, what you're actually moving toward, and why. Seneca described it as the prerequisite for everything else. In his letters to Lucilius, he wrote about the person who is always preparing to live, accumulating knowledge, building habits, refining systems, but never arriving at the life itself. Because the life itself requires knowing what you're living for, and that knowledge doesn't come from reading. It comes from looking. Clarity for the Stoics wasn't inspiration. It wasn't a feeling of alignment that descends on good mornings. It was the result of a specific kind of internal honesty that most people spend their entire lives successfully avoiding. You've probably felt the edges of that avoidance. The moment a question about what you actually want gets too specific and something in you deflects, changes the subject, reaches for a practical concern, not because the question is unanswerable, but because the answer might require something you're not sure you're ready to do with it. That deflection has a cost, and it accumulates in exactly the place you've been feeling it most. The reason people avoid it isn't what you might think. The noise you chose to keep. There is a specific kind of internal noise that doesn't feel like noise, it feels like you. Like the natural texture of your concerns, your ambitions, your sense of what matters and what doesn't. It feels so familiar that questioning it seems strange, almost like questioning whether your own thoughts belong to you. But some of what's running inside your head right now wasn't chosen. It was inherited, absorbed, taken on at a stage of life when you didn't yet have the capacity to evaluate it, and never put down since, because it became part of the background so gradually you stopped noticing it was there. The ambition that belongs to someone else's definition of success, the standard of achievement set by a context you no longer live in, the fear of a specific kind of failure that was catastrophic to a younger version of you. in a situation that no longer exists, for reasons that no longer apply. These things don't announce themselves as foreign, they present themselves as obvious as simply the way things are, as what any reasonable person in your position would naturally want, and that's exactly what makes them so effective at blocking clarity. Because clarity requires looking at what you actually want, not what you've been trained to want, not what makes sense given the story you've been telling about your life, not what would be consistent with the image you've been quietly maintaining. What you actually want. And to get there, you have to be willing to pass through something most people treat as threatening. The recognition that some of what you're carrying isn't yours. Marcus Aurelius wrote in the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius about the opinions of others, how they live inside a person long after the people themselves are gone. How a man can spend decades building toward an image of himself that was constructed entirely from external judgment, absorbed so early it feels indistinguishable from genuine desire. He didn't write this as abstract philosophy. He wrote it as personal observation, a man catching himself in the pattern and naming it before it could continue operating without examination. The noise you've chosen to keep isn't random, it's familiar, and familiar is the most convincing disguise that borrowed meaning has ever found. Here is what that noise actually does to your days. It creates a permanent background calculation, a quiet, continuous comparison between what you're doing and what the absorbed standard says you should be doing. Every hour of genuine rest carries a faint sense of wasted time. Every choice that belongs to who you actually are, but not to who you were trained to be, generates a low-level friction that feels like guilt, but isn't. Every morning that doesn't begin with the urgency that borrowed ambition demands feels like falling behind in a race you never consciously entered. That background calculation is expensive. Not in any single moment, but across thousands of days, it quietly consumes the same cognitive and emotional resources you need to build genuine direction. It keeps you busy moving toward things that were never really yours, while the things that are yours wait, unexamined, somewhere beneath the noise. You've been solving for the wrong variable, not because you weren't paying attention, because the right variable was hidden inside something you never thought to question. And that thing, the specific identity you've been protecting without realizing it, is where this actually gets uncomfortable. The identity you're still protecting. There is a version of you that was built to survive something, not a dramatic event necessarily. Sometimes it was just a prolonged environment, a household with specific rules about what success looked like, a peer group where a certain kind of person earned respect, a period in your life where one version of yourself worked and everything else felt dangerous. That version learned what to project, what to suppress, what to pursue, and what to treat as unacceptable weakness. It learned all of this before you had the philosophical vocabulary to evaluate any of it. And it's still running. Not loudly, not obviously. It runs in the background of your decisions, in the specific ambitions you feel embarrassed to abandon, in the directions you keep moving, even when they no longer feel like yours, in the quiet discomfort that arrives whenever you consider doing something that version of you would have called a mistake. It doesn't feel like an old pattern. It feels like common sense. It feels like knowing yourself, but it isn't knowing yourself. It's protecting a self that may have already outlived its usefulness. This is what makes clarity genuinely difficult, not intellectually but emotionally. Because clarity at a certain depth requires you to look at that protected identity and ask a question most people spend their entire adult lives avoiding. Is this actually mine? Not was it ever useful? Not does it make sense given where I came from? Is it mine now? Does it reflect what I actually value? Or does it reflect what I learned to value in a context that no longer exists? Epictetus addressed this with a directness that can feel almost aggressive in translation. In his discourses, he described the person who mistakes inherited opinion for personal truth as someone living inside someone else's house and calling it home. The structure feels solid, the rooms are familiar, but none of it was built for who you actually are, only for who you needed to appear to be. Marcus Aurelius returned to a version of this question almost obsessively in the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. Not as self-criticism, as examination. He kept asking himself what was actually driving his choices beneath the layer of stated reasoning, not to destabilize himself, but because he understood that an unexamined identity doesn't stay neutral. It actively shapes what you pursue, what you allow yourself to want, and what you quietly rule out before the thought is even fully formed. The armor doesn't feel like armor. That's the problem. It feels like character. It feels like the accumulated wisdom of everything you've been through. And releasing it, even partially, even the pieces that no longer serve anything, feels like losing something real. Think about the last time you considered changing direction, not a small adjustment, a real change. The kind that would require abandoning something the protected identity treats as non-negotiable. And notice what happened in your body before you even fully formed the thought. The resistance that arrived not as a reasoned objection, but as a physical sensation. A contraction, a quiet but unmistakable signal that said, not this. That signal isn't wisdom, it's protection. And protection, when it operates without examination, makes every genuine choice feel like a threat, even when what you're releasing was never yours to begin with. And that recognition, sitting with it honestly without rushing past it, is not the end of this process. It's the beginning of the only part that actually changes anything. What clarity actually looks like in practice. Clarity doesn't arrive like an answer. It arrives like a reduction, a gradual removal of everything that was generating noise without generating direction. And the practice that produces it isn't dramatic. It isn't a retreat or a revelation or a single conversation that changes everything. It's smaller than that, more ordinary, and far more demanding precisely because of how ordinary it is. Seneca described it in his letters to Lucilius with a specificity that separates him from every modern productivity framework. He wasn't prescribing goals or systems. He was prescribing examination, a daily honest accounting of what you actually did, why you actually did it, and whether the person who made those choices was someone you consciously chose to be or someone you defaulted into. He called it the practice of returning to yourself, not as metaphor, as literal daily behavior. Here is what that looks like in real terms. Not at the end of a long reflection, not after a crisis forces the question. In the ordinary morning before the day has filled itself with everything that will make examination feel impossible. One question. Not what do I need to do today? What is today actually for, given what I genuinely value, given who I'm trying to become, given the specific life I'm building rather than the one I inherited or drifted into? That question sounds simple. It isn't. Because answering it honestly requires already having done some of the work described in the previous sections, having looked at what you're carrying that isn't yours, having identified what you're protecting that no longer needs protection. Without that, the question just returns the default answer, the familiar one, the one the protected identity would give. Marcus Aurelius practiced a version of this every morning throughout the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. He didn't call it a clarity practice. He called it returning to the ruling faculty, the part of the mind capable of genuine judgment rather than reactive response. The part that can look at what the day is asking and determine, from a place of actual values rather than habit, what deserves attention and what doesn't. The result isn't certainty. It was never certainty, it's orientation. The difference between a man who moves because he knows where he's going and a man who moves because movement feels better than stillness. Both are in motion. Only one is going somewhere. And that difference, which sounds philosophical from a distance, is felt in the most ordinary moments. In the morning before the negotiation begins. In the afternoon when the familiar drift starts pulling. In the evening when you close the day and know, without having to calculate it, whether the hours produced something real. That feeling isn't a reward for doing everything right. It's what becomes available when you finally know what right means for you specifically, not in the abstract, not borrowed from someone else's definition, but in the quiet, unambiguous way that only comes from having looked honestly at what you actually are. Start with this. Tomorrow morning, before anything else opens, before the phone, before the inbox, before the first task on any list, take 3 minutes. Not to plan, not to review, to ask one question and sit with whatever arrives before the defended version does. What is today actually for? Write down the first answer, not the optimal one, the honest one, and let that be the orientation point for what follows, not a rigid plan, a direction. Something true enough to move from without negotiating first. That's where it begins, small, ordinary, and entirely yours. The morning after clarity. Imagine a morning where the negotiation doesn't happen. Not because everything is perfect, not because the list is short, or the day is easy, or the circumstances finally aligned the way you've been waiting for them to, but because you already know with a quietness that doesn't require defending what the day is for, what you're moving toward, what deserves your attention and what doesn't. Not as a plan, as an orientation that was already in place before you opened your eyes. That's not a fantasy. It's what becomes possible when clarity has been built at the level where it actually holds. It doesn't feel like inspiration. It doesn't feel like motivation. It feels like the absence of the friction that used to be there. Like the negotiation simply didn't show up, because the question it was built around has already been answered. And that answer, quiet, unspectacular, yours, is enough to move from. This is what the Stoics were pointing at, not the dramatic transformation, not the arrival at some permanent state of philosophical peace. Marcus Aurelius didn't write the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius because he had solved this. He wrote them because he was working on it. Every morning in private, one honest line at a time, returning to the same questions, not because the answers kept changing, but because the practice of returning was itself the thing that kept him oriented. You don't need more time. You need to know what the time is for, and that knowledge doesn't come from adding anything. It comes from the kind of honest reduction this video has been describing, from looking at what you're carrying, what you're protecting, what you've inherited without choosing, and deciding, deliberately, what still belongs and what can be put down. Start there. Not with a new system, not with a restructured morning routine. With one honest question, asked tomorrow before the day fills itself with everything that makes honesty feel inconvenient. What is today actually for? Not what do I need to get done? Not what would make me feel productive? What is today for? Given the life I'm genuinely trying to build, given the person I actually want to become, given what I know about myself when I'm being honest rather than performing. Ask that question. Write down the first answer that comes before the defended version arrives. Don't analyze it. Don't optimize it. Just let it be there in front of you, on the page or in your mind as the orientation point for what follows. That's where clarity begins. Not in a revelation. In a question asked honestly one morning at a time, you were never short on time. You were short on the one thing that makes time mean something. Now you know what that is, and you know where to find it. And if something in this video stayed with you, not as an idea but as a feeling you recognize from somewhere inside your own days, then maybe that's worth following. Not because this channel has all the answers, but because the questions we avoid the longest tend to be the ones that matter most. If that's the kind of conversation you want to keep having, subscribe, turn on notifications, and leave a comment below, because I genuinely read every one of them, one by one. And more often than not, the next video is born from what you write there, from the experiences you share, from the kind of pain that almost no one around you can name, but that you carry quietly every single day. You are not alone in this. And the fact that you're still here says more about you than you probably realize. See you in the next one.